Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, November 15th, 2018. Today's podcast is dedicated to the memory of David Schwartz. Dave passed away in Sacramento on Monday night after a lengthy battle with bone cancer. And Dave was married to one of my radio producers, Mary Finn, who worked very well with me back in the 1990s. And then she and Dave had 3 kids. They're all raised, and I think the last one may be in college now. And there will be no Peter B. Collins podcast tomorrow because I will be in Sacramento attending Dave's funeral. Dave was an inventor, an entrepreneur who did well in Silicon Valley, and he doesn't have anything to apologize for his work in tech. But Facebook has a lot of apologizing to do. There's a blockbuster investigation published last night by the New York Times. I printed it out. It runs 31 pages. And it is a blistering indictment of the internal processes at Facebook. And it chronicles how they responded to the attacks blamed for Trump's election because of Russian manipulation of Facebook. I don't buy that. But their reaction to it is quite reprehensible. And the Times laid it out in this report. And, of course, it expresses their bias that the Russia investigation is serious and that the Russian use of Facebook had a material impact on the election, matters that I deeply dispute. But it's not in dispute that Facebook knew almost a year before they admitted it publicly that Russian hackers were poking around on Facebook accounts, and the Times reports that Facebook accumulated evidence of Russian activity for over a year before executives opted to share what they knew with the public and even their own board of directors. Now, this points up to the corporate governance problem. Mark Zuckerberg controls 60% of the voting shares of Facebook. And that's why whatever pressure there's been calling for him to bring in some adult supervision, it doesn't matter. Zuckerberg has absolute control over the company that he started, and he took out the Winklevoss brothers, so there's no claim left there. And the Times says that the company was afraid of Trump supporters, and when Trump called for a ban on Muslim immigration in 2015, Facebook employees and outside critics called on the company to punish him. And Zuckerberg considered it, asking subordinates whether Trump had violated the company's rules and his account should be suspended. But he deferred to subordinates who warned that penalizing Trump would set off a damaging backlash among Republicans. Now, part of the reason here that I'm inferring is that once they got on the defensive, Sheryl Sandberg started hiring Republican advisors. We're going to get into detail about one of them in a moment here. But inside the bubble of the glass conference room at Facebook, and I've been there and seen it, where Mark Zuckerberg presides, you have to ask if he's getting good advice and if people are willing to tell him things that he doesn't want to hear. So Facebook hired Democratic Senator Mark Warner's former chief of staff to lobby him. Sheryl Sandberg leaned in and called Senator Amy Klobuchar to complain about her criticism. And then they launched an influence campaign. Now, that's the language that's been used by the intelligence community to describe Russian meddling in our election in 2016. And Facebook is central to those claims of influence campaign. So Facebook hired a Republican-linked company and set them loose to try to run interference, to try to get even with perceived enemies of Facebook. And those efforts included depicting George Soros as the force behind a broad anti-Facebook movement. And get this, you're going to hear a little bit more in just a moment, a quote from one of the top executives at the George Soros Open Society Foundation. But Facebook used its friends at the Anti-Defamation League to push back on attacks on Zuckerberg, suggesting that they were anti-Semitic. And at the very same time, this influence company was spreading information. The firm is called Definers Public Affairs. They published dozens of negative articles about tech companies, and in particular, they claimed by publishing articles through a murky subsidiary or affiliate that Soros was to blame. Now, Soros is Jewish, and in the recent campaign, he was one of the dozen or so people targeted by the Trump-loving pipe bomber suspect. So that is so disgusting, to use anti-Semitism as both a weapon and a defense. After Tim Cook, Apple's chief executive, quipped in an interview that his company doesn't traffic in personal data like Facebook does, Zuckerberg ordered his management team to use only Android phones. After all, he said the operating system had far more users than Apple's. And so you see a petty dictator at the top of a corporate organization where nobody can call him out. Nobody can criticize Mark Zuckerberg. And the Times account suggests that most of the time he's over there in Geekland, and he leaves it to other people to run the advertising operation and to deal with Washington. One way they've dealt with Washington is passing large amounts of campaign cash to friends, like Chuck Schumer of New York, the top Democrat in the Senate, who raised more money from Facebook employees than any other member of Congress during the 2016 cycle. So this Definers Public Affairs is an organization that was started by a Republican who had worked for Jeb Bush. Definers tried to cast George Soros, a long-standing target of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on the far right, as the driving force behind Facebook critics. As late as this summer, the Times reported the firm was circulating documents that put Soros as the unacknowledged force behind what appeared to be a broad anti-Facebook movement. At the same time, this is according to the Guardian's account, Facebook lobbied a Jewish civil rights group to cast some criticism of the company as anti-Semitic. That would be the Anti-Defamation League. So, the top dog at the Open Society Foundation's Patrick Gaspard wrote a blistering letter to Sheryl Sandberg. And here are a couple of quotes. There is a concerted right-wing effort the world over to demonize Mr. Soros and his foundations, which I lead, an effort which has contributed to death threats, the delivery of a pipe bomb to Mr. Soros' home. You are no doubt also aware that much of this hateful and blatantly false and anti-Semitic information is spread via Facebook. The notion that your company, at your direction, actively engaged in the same behavior to try to discredit people exercising their First Amendment rights to protest Facebook's role in disseminating vile propaganda is frankly astonishing to me. But at the bottom, this is not about George Soros or the foundations. Your methods threaten the very values underpinning our alleged democracy. Now, I haven't seen the film that I'm going to tell you about, but Steve Zeltzer is a man I've known for 20 years. He is a labor activist and independent media activist, and he files a report from Paris that I'm linking to in the show file for today's podcast. He interviewed film directors Hans Block and Moritz Riesevik. I think that's how we pronounce that. They have a new documentary called The Cleaners, which looks at the role of the Facebook workers who are tasked with sanitizing Facebook of content that they deem unacceptable. And they talk about how most of these content reviewers are in the Philippines. I know there's a bunch of them in Ireland. That's because they work cheaper than Americans would. But as the filmmakers point out in their interview with Zeltzer, well, they lack information about the context of American idioms, American political speech. And sure, they can find a nude picture and take it down. But do they understand the nuances? And they are told that they have to review something like 1,000 images a day. How can you possibly study in depth things that, are borderline when you have a quota like that. So I'm looking forward to seeing this film, and I thank Steve Zeltzer for tipping me to its existence. So those cleaners, the content reviewers at Facebook, together with management, we have a new report today, possibly to distract us from the New York Times mega report, that Facebook has removed 1.5 billion fake accounts, targeting 12.4 million pieces of terrorist propaganda, 2.2 billion pieces of spam, 66 million pieces of content that ran afoul of rules barring nudity and sexual activity. Don't you feel better? Now, this is the kind of spin that they hired the disinformation company Definers Public Affairs to help them with. And today they fired Definers. Again, saying that Zuckerberg and Sandberg had no idea of the full range of activities of this company contractor. So once again, we can have no confidence that there was more than an arbitrary approach to plucking these accounts. And the idea that they removed 1.5 billion fake accounts, it's really kind of meaningless. Because we know that Twitter has allowed people to have multiple accounts because the account count is used to impress their investors, to force the share prices up, and it's also used to buffalo advertisers and those people who pay $5 to boost a post on Facebook that, you can reach millions and millions, if not billions of people. And so I find this to be just more bullshit from Facebook. Well, about a week after Trump fired Jeff Sessions, Attorney General, and plucked in the loyalist Matt Whitaker, I have to assume that somewhere over the past week, Matt Whitaker has been able to whisper in Trump's ear and update him on the status of the Mueller witch hunt. Now, as you know, I support the Mueller investigation. I am dubious about the whole Russia meddling contour or narrative, and I await real evidence to support those contentions. But I also believe that Trump has willfully obstructed justice on multiple occasions and that Mueller should be able to prove that. And so I support the continuation of this investigation on that basis. But Trump is apparently feeling bruised because over the last week he has spent 3 days with his private lawyers struggling to answer the questions in written form that Mueller and his investigators have presented to the president. So today he reverted to Twitter. Quote, "The inner workings of the Mueller investigation are a total mess." Well, how do you know that, Don? I imagine Whitaker told you. He continued, "They've found no collusion and have gone absolutely nuts. They are screaming and shouting at people, horribly threatening them to come up with the answers they want. They are a disgrace to our nation." Now, Trump does not cite a source for any of this insight into the Mueller investigation. Maybe he heard from Jerome Corsi, who announced this week that he expects to be indicted by Mueller. After some 40 hours of interrogation, he claimed his brain went to mush. Did he get shouted at? Did they scream at Jerome Corsi? Well, I don't have much sympathy for him. Anyway, the tweet went on to part 2, which includes an error. Let's see. I got to go back to page 1 here. So, they are a disgrace to our nation, and part 2, don't care how many lives they ruin. He left off the Y. These are angry people, capital A, capital P, including the highly conflicted Bob Mueller, who worked for Obama for 8 years. Now, Bob Mueller was appointed FBI director by George W. Bush. He's a protege of Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California. And he served actually for 6 years during the Obama administration. A 2-year extension was given for no public reasons that were offered, and I bristled at that at the time. But Trump can't even get the basic information right. The rest of his tweet, they won't even look at all the bad acts and crimes on the other side. Well, that's true. A total witch hunt, like no other in American history. So the struggle with this take-home exam seems to have pushed Trump into a new range of madness. Yesterday, Jeff Flake once again got to strut his stuff. He is promising that he will not vote for a Republican judicial nominee, and he does hold a swing vote on the Judiciary Committee, so that's a threat he can actually carry out. But he says he'll block all of the judicial nominees until his bill to protect Special Counsel Mueller goes to a vote. And Mitch McConnell refused again yesterday. He blocked it. That's when Flake made his declaration. This is not a moment, he said, for our national leadership to be weak or irresolute. Well, Jeff, if you could stand strong even for an hour, you might be more believable. So the Senate Judiciary Committee passed the Mueller Protection Bill months ago, but Mitch McConnell repeatedly refused to bring it forward for a vote. He argued the bill is unnecessary because there's no sign that Trump will fire Mueller. Flake says that's no longer true. The justification given in April for not bringing it to the floor for a vote was that nobody was being fired. Nothing to see here. Special counsel was not in any danger. That clearly is not the case now. I want to recommend a long read published at The Intercept today by a woman who I've interviewed several times over the years. She was a very young, I think one of the youngest serving members of Congress at the time, when she was appointed to the Special Committee on Impeachment, the Watergate Committee. Her name is Elizabeth Holtzman. She represented a district in New York with some distinction for many years. And I want to recommend this piece because while she does embrace the Russia-meddled narrative as part of her bases for impeachment, she goes well beyond that into the obstruction of justice charges and, of course, the emoluments clause. And she also argues with the Democrats who say, oh, we can't impeach him because we might fail. And she says, many people worry that it will only further polarize an already deeply divided nation, or that there will not be enough votes in the Republican-controlled Senate to convict him. Just calling for an inquiry will be viewed as a Democratic Party attack on the head of another party, a kind of coup d'etat. But she's not afraid. She says, as a junior congresswoman, the youngest ever elected at that time, I served on the House Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Nixon for the high crimes and misdemeanors he committed in connection with the Watergate cover-up and other matters. And so the rest of her 19-page article here lays out what she calls her blueprint for impeachment. And as I said, with the caveat about the Russia stuff, I do embrace it, and I consider her to be a thoughtful and respectful supporter of the Constitution. Meanwhile, Ray McGovern's been at it again. He attended an event at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington on Tuesday, and he took with him a copy of James Clapper's tell-all book, Facts and Fears, Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. And Jimmy Clapper, you know, was the top dog, the director of national intelligence, who published these reports about Russian meddling. And you know my opinion of all that. Well, what Ray did was so clever because he quoted a passage from Clapper's book to James Clapper. Quote, the White House aimed to justify why an invasion of Iraq were necessary, with a public narrative that condemned its continued development of weapons of mass destruction, for which the intelligence community had no evidence. And Clapper goes on to basically admit that, we presented these reports and we basically knew they were false. And so Ray powers up to a question saying, well, based on your admissions that you fudged intelligence to enable Bush to go to war in Iraq, did you fudge intelligence for the Obama administration to create this illusion of collusion between Trump and Russia? And we only got one statement here from Ray in his article. Clapper said he could not explain why the president said that. And what's referring to is the last press conference that Obama gave. He said that the claims of Russian hacking of the DNC and the passage to WikiLeaks were inconclusive. So this is unsatisfying. And so I will get on the phone later today and see if we can line Ray McGovern up for an interview early next week and get him to explain more about at least the reaction of James Clapper to this powerful confrontation from Ray McGovern. And Ray's colleague from the CIA who's also now publishing occasionally at Consortium News, John Kiriakou, a man I greatly respect. He was a CIA analyst. He was in charge of the counterinsurgency program in Pakistan, and he went to prison under the Espionage Act in a targeted prosecution by the Obama administration. So he does have a bias, and he probably feels that he was unfairly punished when people like Brennan and Clapper were not. Now, with that aside, there is new information that John Brennan ordered CIA hackers to intercept the emails of all potential or possible intelligence community whistleblowers who may have been trying to contact the congressional oversight committees. And as Kiriakou points out, this would be a crime in itself. But then in 2014, he says Brennan and Clapper classified the notifications to the key congressional committees about their order to spy on them. As a result, the chair of Judiciary, Chuck Grassley, knew of the hacking but couldn't say anything, while senators on neither the Intelligence or Judiciary committees apparently didn't know. And Kiriakou says it's a felony to classify a crime and a felony to classify something solely for the purpose of preventing embarrassment. And he said this kind of overclassification is illegal, but few Americans know because this law is not enforced. Amen to that. We have never seen the overclassification properly busted and the people who did it held responsible. So this is a strong piece, and I encourage you to read it. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. Every day I pause for a minute to thank you, the people who support my work with your subscriptions to the PBC podcast. There's Abby McMillan in Maine, Faith Peoples, I think she's in Pittsburgh, Joey Perillo, Philadelphia, and Wendy Gebauer out there somewhere in a great state in America. I don't know where Wendy lives. Anyway, these are people who kick in $5 to $20 a month to support my work, and I invite you to help out too. Just visit peterbcollins.com, click menu, click Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and from there it's easy to make your choices. And by the way, I always offer this option. If you're allergic to PayPal, and you've got good reasons for that, you can communicate, send me a check, money order, even cash, to Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And I much appreciate it. You can also send me things that don't involve cash or subscriptions. I enjoy getting information and guest suggestions from my listeners. So the Saudis have come up with, I think, the sixth explanation for how Jamal Khashoggi died at the consulate in Istanbul in early October. The latest spin is that the 15-man team sent to confront him had orders to return him to the kingdom, but after he resisted, they decided on the spot to kill and dismember him. So the public prosecutor is requesting the death penalty for 5 people of the 15-man team. We don't know which ones. That has not been disclosed. And, of course, the death penalty is the sentence for virtually every major crime in Saudi Arabia. So while this may seem dramatic, chances are it's not. And the account, of course, contradicts previous statements regarding the killing, where, they admitted that, well, it doesn't really matter because they're just all over the map on that. But the people in Turkey, led by the Prime Minister Erdogan, they are keeping the pressure on to force a disclosure. And, of course, they want to see the blame pinned on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, the Saudi prosecutor acknowledged that the killers had quickly cut up the body in this spur-of-the-moment decision after an unintended killing, and that's, of course, why they planned ahead and brought that bone saw that everybody knew about. And, of course, there's the phone call back to the Saudi palace saying, yep, the job is done. Tell your boss. Meanwhile, there was an interesting showdown related to Saudi Arabia in the United States Senate yesterday, and Rand Paul had a moment or maybe even 10 minutes of principle. They voted against an effort to block arms sales to Bahrain, pitched by backers as a means of forcing that nation to stop participating in the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. 21 senators voted in support of the effort to end the arms sale. But Bahrain, which hosts the Navy's Fifth Fleet, is essential to the upcoming war on Iran. And so, on a bipartisan basis, we saw people like Bob Corker and Bob Menendez, senators from Tennessee and New Jersey, respectively, stand up and say, oh, we can't do this. And keep in mind that Bahrain was the very special nation that donated $1 million to the Clinton Foundation and then demanded an immediate meeting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and they got it, and it led to a policy change by the U.S. in the middle of the so-called Arab Spring. It enabled the crackdown on dissent in Bahrain. So Rand Paul deserves a little credit here. He said, look, this is an essential proxy vote because we're not being allowed a direct vote on the war in Yemen. Rand Paul said the Saudis aren't getting the message. The Bahrainis are part of the coalition. Send them a message. Trump has announced plans to end in-flight refueling of Saudi planes operating in Yemen and issued sanctions against 17 Saudis allegedly involved in Khashoggi's assassination. But Paul blurts out the truth here. He ridiculed Trump's sanctions after noting that Saudi leaders had already asked for the United States to end the in-air refueling of its planes. As to the sanctions, Rand Paul called them a way of pretending to do something and doing nothing, arguing that many of the sanctioned individuals were already in Saudi jails, probably facing the death penalty. Quote, people respect strength. We don't show strength unless we do something that is more dramatic than putting sanctions on people who are in prison. And Rand Paul has also advocated invoking the War Powers Resolution to force the U.S. to fully end its support for Saudi's Yemen war effort, but can't muster enough votes in the Senate. Over in the House, Republicans blocked a similar effort by tucking a rule change into a bill about managing the gray wolf population that effectively blocked proponents of a resolution to end the war in Yemen, and I believe that effort has been led by Barbara Lee of Oakland. And Ro Khanna stood up and spoke up. He is the freshman, or actually I guess he's in his second term, from Silicon Valley. It's shameful that Speaker Ryan and House Republicans denied Congress the chance to do our constitutional duty while millions of lives are at stake in Yemen. History will remember this abdication of duty. The whatever war continues in Afghanistan 17 years now. And did you know that there's been a blackout on reporting the death count for the last 18 months? But President Ghani of Afghanistan yesterday kind of broke that policy and admitted that 242 security force members were killed in the past week alone. And he said that the total death count is over 28,000 of Afghan police officers and soldiers. That doesn't include civilians, since 2015. And that some 2,000 Americans have been killed in Afghanistan, 58 since 2015, when Obama claimed that the U.S. role in that war was over. And what's interesting is that the Times deserves some credit. That's where I got this report. But they didn't bother to mention, in a recap of the basic fundamentals about the war in Afghanistan, that last year the United States dropped more bombs on Afghanistan than it did in any previous year since we started this mess back in 2002. Yes, Trump exceeded Obama's 2010 surge. There, the tonnage of munitions dropped was 5,213 last year. It was 5,100 at Obama's peak in 2010. But whatever, man, who cares? It's just Afghanistan. The Brexit deal in Britain led to a contentious cabinet meeting yesterday, and Prime Minister Theresa May spent 3 hours of question time before Parliament, the House of Commons, and it remains contentious. The lead negotiator of Brexit, Dominic Raab, that's R-A-A-B, announced his resignation in anger this morning, and another cabinet member, Esther McVey, also resigned. Theresa May said leadership is about taking the right decisions, not the easy ones. Am I going to see this through, she asked, and then she answered her own question. Yes, she said. The contentious Florida recount continues, and Trump has inserted himself again with idiotic comments. He told the Daily Caller, the Republicans don't win, and that's because of potentially illegal votes. What is a potentially illegal vote? They either are illegal or they aren't. When people get in line that have absolutely no right to vote, and they go around in circles, sometimes they go to their car, put on a different hat, a different shirt, come in and vote again. Nobody takes anything. It's really a disgrace what's going on. Now, then he added that he wants a new national voter ID law, because if you buy a box of cereal, you have a voter ID. What the fuck's he talking about? Anyway, this is unhelpful, because they're feverishly trying to recount votes on the machine recount, and it's clear that Palm Beach County will not be able to complete that by the deadline, which has passed here this afternoon, and it's unclear whether the state will accept details or recount data that comes in after the deadline. A manual recount of ballots rejected by machines has been ordered in the Senate race, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Broward County has finished its recount except for about 400 damaged ballots, and it is Palm Beach that has these machines that have repeatedly broken down, and when they fix them, they didn't tabulate correctly, and so they're really struggling just to put two and two together to figure out who voted for whom and what the tally is. And as I mentioned, thousands of Florida voters whose ballots were set aside, uncounted, have been given extra time until this Saturday at 5 p.m. to cure their ballots. U.S. District Court Judge Mark Walker found a state law has been applied unconstitutionally, and there appear to be 4,000 to 5,000 ballots that were rejected because of signature issues. And the judge notes the precise issue in this case is whether Florida's law that allows county election officials to reject vote-by-mail and provisional ballots for mismatched signatures with no standards, an illusory process to cure, and no process to challenge the rejection passes constitutional muster? The answer is simple. It does not. Of course, Rick Scott wants to stop the counting of the votes, wants to stop valid votes from being included, and the Republicans immediately filed a lawsuit trying to bump this up to a federal court and a federal appeals court and bypass this district court ruling. So it's anybody's guess how this turns out. And if I had to predict, so I will, at this point, it's going to be decided by a court somewhere. And the decision will be to stop the votes from being counted. Got a couple of more stories here as I head into overtime, but I think they're important. Ohio Democrat Marcia Fudge has surfaced as a challenger to Nancy Pelosi for the Democratic caucus vote on choosing the next speaker. Nancy Pelosi's uber confident that she's got the 218 votes she needs to win the speakership. Maybe she's got some Republicans who owe her. But Marcia Fudge, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, appears to be stepping up. And from what I can tell, there are only about 20 or 30 votes for her. But because the margins are so narrow, Pelosi has to try to persuade people to vote present in order to reduce the margin needed for her to claim a victory in the caucus. And then when it goes to the full House in January, it's likely that Republicans will fall in line and choose whoever the Democratic side prefers. But it has gotten a little messy, and I hate to hear people say that it's sexist or anything else. It is time for a change. And I've been saying this about my friend Nancy Pelosi for 2.5, maybe 3 years now. Meanwhile, the Republicans, in a 159-43 vote, selected Kevin McCarthy of Bakersfield as the House Minority Leader. He is, without a doubt, the most single incoherent babbler in American politics today. Good luck with that one. I've linked to an article, a commentary published in the San Francisco Chronicle today by a top former California Republican lawmaker in the state assembly. Her name is Kristen Olson. And the dramatic headline, "The GOP is dead in California." A couple of quotes. "The grand old party is dead, partly because it has failed to separate itself from today's toxic national brand of Republican politics. I've spent my entire adult life in Republican politics, so it wasn't easy for me to say this," she said. But The Republican Party, promoted by Trump and his brand of national politics, has lost our way. It's killing any opportunity for political balance and thoughtful debate in California, elements that good public policy relies on. And it's led to one-party rule for new Governor Gavin Newsom, who has supermajorities in both houses and is sitting on a $9 billion surplus, a big gift left to him by Governor Jerry Brown. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. I'll be back on Monday right here. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.